We've been journeying through Advent, and Advent is a great time, but it's not necessarily always a fun time. It highlights the idea, it reminds us that we do have hope. But the problem with hope is that it's something that we're looking forward to in the future, and we don't have some stuff yet. And so Advent, it's great to remind ourselves of these things, and it's great to look at the taste that we have now of something that we're looking forward to in a bigger way. But it also reminds us that we don't have it completely yet in this life. And so Advent it's not always fun because it can be bittersweet. It reminds us that we're looking for something still in our life. And it builds in us a longing for that thing to come that we don't have yet. We're not happy about it yet. And we don't have the fullness of the things that we've talked about. The peace. Peace isn't fully realized. The hope, the joy, and the love. Today we look at love. Today we look at the theme of love, and as we've gotten to get to this point, we've looked first at hope, which is something that's coming in the future. We've looked at peace. Peace is that thing that we believe the Prince of Peace came to earth. We believe that he spoke the words of peace to us. The God who we thought was at war with us for thousands of years through the world, through the history of humanity, through the world. God's has been at war with us. They haven't liked us. They haven't been at peace with us. And God comes to earth to say, I'm at peace with you. I've never been at war with you. And so we have this inkling of peace, but yet we still don't have full peace. We struggle with peace between each other. I struggle with peace within myself, with myself. And very often I struggle to still comprehend the peace that God holds towards me. And we've gone to joy. We've looked at joy, and joy is another that we looked at last week with Zechariah. And what's interesting with his story is that he doesn't have joy in the moment. We saw that he lacked joy. But God said his messenger said there's a time coming where you will have joy. And so there's an idea that we can have joy for the joy to come. There's joy that there's something coming that will be joyful. But it was impossible for him to work up that joy. And so the angel gifts him with silence. Silence is a chance to absorb what's around us, not to get caught up in the distractions of conversation and everything that I want to say. Now I have to sit and observe. And as Zechariah sat and observed for those months as he watched the joy of his wife, as she realized she was pregnant, he watched the girlfriends of his wife come over and they planned the nursery. What are we going to make the nursery look like? What toys do we need for this new child? You haven't had any children before, so you have nothing. What hand-me-downs can we pull out of the attic that we can pass your direction? And they sorted through everything. He got to absorb joy from, I believe, the key place where joy comes to us when we can't find it in ourselves. It comes from others. Very often, sometime when we don't have joy, there's other people who do have joy. And then sometimes it comes around to where we suddenly have joy and they don't. Zechariah finds joy from an external source in his silence. I've come to learn the value of that. The value of third-party joy. That I might be down in the dumps. I might be dealing with depression and sadness. But there's those people who, if I hang out with them, they have joy right now. Doesn't mean they won't go through hard times down the road, but I can my joy can come from them. They put a smile on my face. One of the goals of this outfit is the lesson that what someone else does can put a smile on your face. Joy can be found outside of us if we're not so distracted by ourselves to be internally focused and expressing ourselves through conversations that distracts us from what's going on around us. So Zechariah finds joy from, I believe, one of the key places where joy is held for us, when it's not within us, and that's within community. So now we come to love. And one of the biggest struggles with all of Advent is what to do with suffering. What do we do with suffering? And I can't remember exactly how the meme went, but I saw a post recently that talked about, okay, if God is love, then why does he allow suffering? Is he powerful or not? Can he make it stop? If he could make it stop, he would make it stop. And it brings into question, why do we even exist? What is our existence for? Why did we start this whole thing? What was the intention of God? And somehow suffering was built into this. And I think we can look at suffering and possibly consider perhaps we need to redefine suffering in our vision. I've said before, the word repent means simply to change our way of thinking. So perhaps we need to repent of one way we've been looking at suffering. Change our way of thinking to consider, what might suffering actually be? The benefit of suffering is that we suffer to become shaped into what we want to be. I joined the military in the year 2000 into the delayed entry program, which meant that I didn't ship out for about a year. So I signed up, I enlisted, all the paperwork was done, but I wanted to hang around for a little bit, and then I would ship off to basic training. I shipped off to basic training with it in mind that this isn't going to be easy, but I have a picture in my mind of what that suffering is going to turn me into. I have a picture in my mind of what suffering will produce in me. And I start to go down this journey. I wanted to be, for lack of a better word, I want to be Rambo. No, I wanted to be the hero. I wanted to be the guy who got to do cool things and save all the people in danger. And that's who I wanted to be. And so I signed up. And the recruiter tells you, okay, how much suffering do you want? We begin by the suffering of basic training. Beyond that, there's another level of suffering called airborne school. There's special schools, and that's suffering on top of suffering. But it forms you a little bit more. And then we have suffering on top of that called ranger school. Do you want that too? Sure, let's put it in the contract. Let's pile the suffering on. Because for me in my mind, there was the image of what I wanted in the future. So I go and I suffer through basic training. And I did learn that even when you don't feel joy in the moment, when the mud is cold, when you're shivering, when you're going through bad things in basic training that are just miserable, there actually can be a joy in there. Because you're anticipating what's to come. You're anticipating what this is doing to me to make me who I want to be in the end. So I go through basic training. Head off to airborne school, next level of suffering. I go through airborne school. Head off to ranger school. It's called RIP First. It's this indoctrination program where they indoctrinate you on how to be a ranger. And so you begin your suffering there, and they picked us up at airborne school. There were a bunch of us. And they said, there's too many of you. We need to whittle you down. Who just wants to quit right now? And some hands went up. Some people had signed up for 3 layers of suffering, and they'd gone through basic training, they'd gone through airborne school, and they said, I've had enough of the suffering. And so they said, I'll just quit right now. And they said, great. And they gave them the paperwork and they quit. They marched us down to where the RIP program starts. At this point, it was January, temperature, there was snow on the ground. We're in shorts and t-shirts. They put us in our PT shorts and t-shirts, and they stood us in formation in the parking lot. And I said, we'll be back in a second. And they walked away. A second went by, and another second went by. And we're out in the cold, and we're just shivering as we're standing out in the cold. We're suffering. About an hour later, they come back. And they said, okay, this is a taste of what's to come. Who wants to quit now? More hands went up. They counted how many wanted to quit. And they said, enough haven't quit yet. We'll be back in another second. And they left. Realizing, thinking they had made it through this first hour and it was over, facing a second hour, people just up and walked to the office to quit. They said, I won't do another hour. The suffering continued, and finally got enough people to quit. They said, we will not stop the suffering until enough people quit. They got enough people to quit, so we finally started what's called RIP. In the middle of this suffering, a guy comes, and my ultimate goal, I don't know if it was the John Wayne movie I watched when I was a kid, I don't know. I wanted the Green Beret. I wanted to be Special Forces, and since the time I had enlisted in the year 2000, they had changed some things around. And a Special Forces recruiter comes and he says, hey, if you want to go suffer with us up in North Carolina, you can go straight into Green Beret training. I said, sign me up. So I leave Ranger suffering for Special Forces suffering. I'm going through the suffering there, and in the first week, they're introducing us to the program of suffering that's laid out before us. And as we're sitting in the classroom, guy comes in. Hawaiian shirt, shorts, flip-flops. All I've known is proper military, like uniforms and rank and all this. And once we got to the Special Forces training, they made us first take the rank off. We still had uniforms on, but no rank. You now no longer see where anybody rates. So we're sitting there in the classroom, and this guy comes in, Hawaiian shirt, shorts, flip-flops, and we're like, that guy, who's this guy? And he says, hey, I'm Major so-and-so. And he's like, I'm with Delta Force. And I'm here to tell you about another level of suffering you can go to after this one. And we're like, this is cool. This guy gets to wear Hawaiian shirts, flip-flops, and shorts. And he tells us about Delta Force training. He says, hey, we're going to drop you off in the woods of Virginia. We're going to give you all this stuff. And he says, that's the next level of suffering if you want it. But first I had to make it through Special Forces suffering. In the process, I'm injured. I can't make it any further. And I get dropped. I get released to the 82nd Airborne. I had 82nd Airborne was still, it was great. But it was interesting how I was upset. And I was sad because my suffering had come to an end. My suffering was over. No longer could I suffer to become what I had dreamt of being. It's interesting how in the middle of suffering, even in basic training, in airborne school and everything, We can complain about the suffering. But very often there's something in the back of our minds that if the suffering is for a purpose, we also can make it through. We find joy in it. We realize what it's doing to us for the good. Let's get forward to my notes here, then figure out what to speak on. Christians in the New Testament, Christians in the early church. Like I looked at Rambo when I enlisted in the military. They looked at Jesus. Jesus had come and he'd blown their mind. We talked several weeks ago about how the number one verse for the early church for 300 years was love your enemies. This was mind-blowing. They wanted to be like Jesus. And they saw their suffering as making them into Jesus. What I saw suffering as doing in the army, they said all the suffering in life, Jesus was shaped by coming down here and living through suffering. So therefore, if I have him as the end in mind, I rejoice over all the suffering because it's making me like Jesus. Just like I'm rejoicing over crawling through mud because I'm like, this is making me like Rambo. And so they rejoiced in suffering because Jesus had given them a perspective on suffering that showed them what the end could hold. In Advent, we actually consider with our hope of what the end will hold. So there's suffering. Good instructors. Instructors that I realize in the military, good instructors, they don't enjoy your suffering. They don't enjoy your suffering. They're not there to make you, they're not abusive individuals. There are abusive individuals who simply want to make you suffer. A good instructor, a loving instructor, he simply says, you got to go suffer. I got to release you. We did when I was in Special Forces training before I got dropped, we did what was called a mini star. One of the things you do to graduate with a Green Beret is you go through the STAR course. It's a land navigation course. They had us do a mini star. It's a practice. And in North Carolina, there's swamps, there's wilderness. It's not pleasant. But to become who I wanted to be, I have to go out into it. So the instructors, they hand you a map. And they tell you, this is the map. Try to stay on course. But it's going to be hard out there. There's swamps. And I love how they talk about there's swamps. And listen, there's this thing in the swamp called a cottonmouth. It's a snake. It'll kill you. The instructors send us out to go suffer because of what they know it will turn us into. But they give us a map to attempt to orientate us. Don't always do well at it. But they give us a map with the goal that the suffering I'm going through in the swamps, in the wilderness, will guide me to the end of where I want to end up. Now, beyond suffering, since we're speaking on love today, we have co-suffering. An example of co-suffering would be, we would have, talk about the military again, we'd have road marches. Road marches, you've got 40 to 60 pounds on your back. You're marching down the road. You have however many miles to go. To graduate basic training for the infantry, we had to do a 25-mile road march. And along the way, it was broken up. And So you're marching for 25 miles while you're doing things as well. In the middle of this, you have friends that you've made. You have people who you've grown to like, and everybody's at one time or another. They're fighting colds. They twisted their ankle the day before, and they're fighting injuries, but they want to make it through. And you like them, and you want them to make it through. So there's soldier one, and he's marching. He has the same weight on him as everyone else does. But because of a situation, he may not make it. He's starting to fall behind. The weight is too much. Co-suffering is the soldier number 2 who comes up and says, I want you to make it. Take your pack off and give it to me. Soldier number 2 has a pack on his back. He takes the second pack and he puts it on the front, and now he's got 2 packs on. He's co-suffering for soldier number 1. The suffering of soldier number 1 has not ended. He's still suffering, but he's no longer being crushed. That's co-suffering love. Co-suffering love moves other people, because then soldier number 3 is going and he sees what soldier number 2 is doing. And after what feels like the right amount of time, he goes to soldier number 2 and he says, give me the pack now for a little bit. Let me carry the weight, and we're going to get this guy through. This is co-suffering love. Jesus came to co-suffer. God came to say, I'm going to show you who I am. I'm going to show you what my love is. It's interesting when you go through special forces training, even with a mini star and with all the things that we're doing to prepare, you go through a class, and at the end of class, you peer someone out. What it means is that rank has been taken off. Everybody is equal in their suffering. You get to the end of the suffering, and you must vote for the person who you say they suffered with us, but we don't want them to continue. The one who usually gets peered out is the one who has not co-suffered. It's the one who says, I have what it takes to make it through, and I'm going to make sure my self-interest is taken care of. I'm going to make it through. Oftentimes you have people of higher rank who they say, I don't have to do this. I don't have to do that. You don't necessarily know their rank because they don't have on their uniform, but you can often very much tell who the higher ranking people are, who don't feel they have to do this stuff. And so you peer people out. And the one who gets peered out is often the one who won't co-suffer. God comes to show, I believe, what has been going on since the beginning of history. He comes to co-suffer. He comes to reveal his co-suffering, and in doing so, he defines the love that we're looking at today. 1 John 3:16, I believe, is the more important Bible verse than John 3:16. Of the two 3:16 verses that John wrote, the first one says, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. But what 1 John 3:16 clarifies is, by this we know what love is. That Jesus came and he died for us. God defines love as co-suffering. That is love. And that wasn't the kind of love that God only used for 33 years that Jesus was on earth. God never changes. Jesus brought into human history before human eyes who God has always been. The co-sufferer. We very much picture ourselves as we're in the sandbox, we're in the play box. And man, I'm getting bullied, I'm getting knocked down, I am just having a horrible time in the sandbox. We picture God as the Father standing outside the sandbox, and we're like, won't you get in the sandbox of suffering and help us? What Jesus shows is that God says, I'm the sandbox. My Spirit's in you. My Spirit is in the bully who beats you up. My Spirit's all around. So Jesus comes and he shows us how to love. Now in basic training, we had this time that we went out to the firing range and we were learning how to use our rifles. And of course, I can't hit anything. Not very well, at least. I'm given this piece of plastic and metal that is the most basic rifle in existence. I don't get in basic training the rifle that I would later have in the 82nd Airborne. The one with lasers and lights and all the accoutrements that they make me so I can just do it. Look, I just hit things because I just have all the attachments on my rifle. Of course I'm not doing well. I don't have what I need to do well. We're on the range and we're struggling. We had a drill sergeant. He's about 6'6", muscled, big guy. He's one of our favorite drill sergeants. We called him Drillzilla. Think of Godzilla. This is Drillzilla. And now you get why we might have a dinosaur theme. Drillzilla comes over and he picks up one of our bare bones rifles. And he gets down on the range. And he starts knocking down targets. He's working with what we had. That we said, of course you can't hit as much stuff because we don't have what it takes to do this stuff. And he's doing it. And he gets up and he hands the rifle back to the soldier who it was his rifle. And he says, this is what you can do with this existence. What we come to learn is that it's not all the fancy stuff. It's the basics. It's the basics that make you proficient. It's the basics that equip you and empower you. And he knew the basics. Basics that we didn't know yet, but we were going to learn them through suffering. I picture that God did this. Very often we say, I would have hope. I would have peace if people would act different. I'd have joy if I had more money. I need the attachments on my rifle to hit the mark. I would be able to hit the mark of love if I had more love in my life. If people loved me better. Jesus is our Drillzilla. Jesus comes to an oppressed people group. To be an oppressed person, he tells us to walk the extra mile. The Romans, they could enlist you to carry their equipment for 1 mile. And he says, walk 2. We don't know how many times Jesus himself had to do this. How many times did Jesus have to live out his own teaching? Jesus comes into an existence that we would say is the most basic. He's poor. It's believed that his dad probably died early on. He's a part of an oppressed people group. He doesn't hold power. All the attachments that we say we can hit the mark if we had all the extras on. And he shows us how it can be done. He's our Drillzilla. Once you get the attachments, it's a little bit nicer. But attachments do you less good when you don't know the basics. You're a handicap to the benefits if you have not first learned how to work without them. And so, is it great to have the attachments? Yes. Could we all wish for more money? Yes. Could we all wish for these things? Yes. But God says, let me show you what you can do with basics. But just like Drillzilla showed us, and then he walks off, and we're filled with hope. We're like, oh, if we suffer, we can be like that. We can do that. I want to be like Rambo. I've added Drillzilla to the list. I want to be like Drillzilla. He can pick up a bare bones existence of a rifle, and he can hit what he wants to hit. And so Jesus comes and he says, let me show you what you can hit with the barest existence. Living under oppression, living on things that people say, this is a bare bones rifle of existence. How am I supposed to hit joy, hit hope, hit love? How am I supposed to hit the target? And he shows us how it can be done. Now, Drillzilla showed us, and we were suddenly filled with joy for the training. We were ready to suffer some more, but we weren't still skilled as him. It would take us a long time to become as skilled as him. If Jesus is our Drillzilla, he's shown us what can be done. He has shown us how love can be lived out. But we're in the suffering of training. We don't have the skills to do it at the level that Jesus shows us how it can be done. I've talked in the past about this false idea that Adam and Eve were made on a perfect pedestal, and then they fell off the pedestal, and we call it the fall. They weren't made perfect. They were made naive. As I've mentioned, I have a perfect flight record. I've never crashed an airplane on landing because I've never flown an airplane yet. Adam and Eve hadn't made a mistake because they hadn't lived life yet. They were only perfect because they hadn't done anything. Humanity was made in the image of God. Humanity can be given a map. Just like I was given a map of a mini star course. Humanity can be shown, just like Drillzilla showed me, what can be done with the basics if we master the basics. But there's one thing that can't just be given unless we're going to be turned into robots and just programmed. Experience. Wisdom. We can be given knowledge, but we can't be given wisdom. We have to live it out. Wisdom is gained through suffering. So love lets us suffer. But what we liked about Drillzilla was that he was a co-sufferer. When we go into the field, we would have to go dig fighting positions, and we'd have to sleep in them in the cold in our sleeping bags. The drill sergeants, they either drove back home for the night and they came back out the next morning, or they had a nice warm building to go sit in. Drillzilla wouldn't do that. He grabbed his sleeping bag and he would come sleep with us. He's like, I know you need to suffer to get to where you need to be, but I want you to know that I'm there with you. That's co-suffering love. This is what God comes in Jesus to show. To see Jesus crucified is for God to say, I'm actually always being crucified with you, even by you often. Yes, we'll wrap up with this. Here's the rub. Here's the rub. Pain has a way of taking our focal point from anything else and putting it right in front of us. Pain has a way of making us short-sighted. And it's hard then when you have short sight to picture what's at the end. I watch people quit through suffering and suffering and suffering in the military because they lost sight of the end and they were drawn to what was right in front of them. It's tough to keep our eye on the end. But Advent invites us to refocus. Every once in a while, a good trainer in the military would realize when enough people were at their breaking point. And he would say, come over here. And there'd be an aside. And he would remind us of why we're doing what we're doing. What is this going to produce in you? It sucks right now, and you may have lost sight of any good that's going to come out of this. But let me refocus you. Advent does that to us. Because in the middle of suffering, I think these are the 4 key things that we miss when we become short-sighted. We lose hope because we don't see an end. We lose peace because we see nothing other than the conflict in front of us. We miss out on joy. Because depression, sadness, anger is all around us right now. And we lose out on hope of love. As we look at love today, one of the things that suffering tries to convince us of is that we're alone. God defined love as not being alone in suffering. That's what this community does for us. It lets us know that we're not alone. The most important part of the church, I believe, is community. Communion was established to sit around a table and commune with each other and commune with God. Advent seeks to renew our awareness of the love of co-suffering. On this Advent Sunday, I guess I remember that true love came once to define what real love is. It's co-suffering. And co-suffering doesn't always mean equal suffering. Co-suffering often means that the weaker one gets to hand off some things to someone else who can take it for a time. But love and co-suffering, it doesn't stop the suffering because it wants us to become who we're meant to be. In the middle of it all, like I talked about last week, it is hard sometimes to talk about joy. It's hard to find these things. But a track record shows that if I put one foot in front of another, the time of hope will come again. The sun will rise again. And I'll encounter great people who co-suffer with me in this community, and I believe a God. So this is the God that we're reminded of during Advent.